Foreign Editor Sophie Mokoena spoke to Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, who was assigned by the former UN Secretary General Koffi Annan to investigate the conflict in Darfur.
Yeah, I'm very sad to hear that, because I had the very singular privilege, and I still remember the day, on the 7th of October 2004, of sitting in his office across the table with him when he was persuading me to accept being one of the 5 commissioners to go to Darfur and investigate reports of violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And after we had had that discussion, Koffi Annan appointed me, and I was one of 5 commissioners under the leadership of Professor Antonio Kasese, who's late, and we went into, firstly we were in Geneva, where we sat and delved into all the reports about, the human rights violations that were taking place in Sudan. And then from there, I went with Kasese and the other commissioners. We went into Darfur itself, and we did on the spot investigations into these reports of the conduct of the Sudanese army, the Janjaweed, and I was privileged, because we were supposed to deliver the result in 90 days. I was privileged to be the one who the chairman asked to remain behind and make sure that the final report has been done, and I sent that final report again to Kofi Annan, and he submitted it to the United Nations Security Council. I believe that our report is largely responsible for the eventual charging of the Sudanese President al-Bashir.
A huge task given to you by this outstanding leader. Your interaction with him, if you were to share your experience, what kind of a leader was Koffi Annan?
What struck me with him was the humility. Here I was sitting across the table, the United Nations Secretary General, a person who must have wined and dined and met and talked and interviewed world leaders. And here was I, a young lawyer from Kala, not even from South Africa, small town in the Bundus in Kala.
In the Eastern Cape.
In the Eastern Cape. And here I was.
In the corridors of the UN.
In the corridors of the UN, sitting across a man who was persuading me to accept a position that I believe was going to change the course of what happened in Darfur. I'm proud of the report, and as I say, I'm going to look for the link, and I'll forward the link to you, because I believe it's a report that is worth making public.
When you look at his tenure at the UN, he had to deal with Iraq war, the HIV pandemic, and later on retirement he had to deal with the Syrian question, but also on the continent, the Kenyan conflict after the elections. Do you think he was able to do his utmost best to address those challenges?
Well, the office of the Secretary General of the United Nations is a thankless task, because you have to be a diplomat extraordinary, because you have to seek to balance your own views with the balance of countries that may be at war, who are ideologically as far apart as the North Pole is to the South Pole. And you are going to be judged by what is perceived to be your own personal ideological inclinations. For instance, in the Syrian war, there would be people who would like to think whether he is a Muslim, and if he's a Muslim, which side of the conflict is he going to take? In the Iraq war, I'm sure he was met with those kinds of dilemmas. And you must remember that he is the only Secretary General. There is the United Nations Security Council, where the world powers sit, Russia, the United States, Great Britain, and those countries, just from what I've said, are ideologically poles apart. So you have to walk a very thin thread, and you must always remember that your position is to engender peace. And as they say, peace is not just the absence of war.
The institution where the norm is to seek consensus, but at times he was very tough taking decisions.
Oh yes. The mere fact that you are confronted with world powers, some of whom, all of whom are ideologically different, or they take different ideological positions. At the end of the day, you must be guided by the United Nations Charter, and it is the influence that the Secretary General wields within the United Nations as an institution that defines his or her role in that position. And therefore he is a very powerful person, and that is why I would believe from now on there's going to be a scramble to try and define whether his legacy was different from the legacy of the Secretary General before him and the Secretary General who's now reigning, who's now in place.
Very loyal to the continent as an African soil, a Ghanaian. He was in the country, in South Africa, recently attending Mandela lecture, and then he went to Zimbabwe.
Yes. Again, even when he is not in office, it's like President Mbeki. He's no longer in office, but because of the role that Koffi Annan played whilst he was Secretary General, there are still countries around the world, especially the countries in Africa, who look up to him when they have got issues that need diplomacy, that need a person of stature, a person of weight who will deal or will hopefully promote the dealing of such problems as they have in a manner that would bring the people closer to peace. He was in charge, he was running an organization that was established by a number of countries in the world for the promotion of peace.
These leaders, or the former leaders, or the former elders, or the current elders, these veterans on the continent, do we value them? Do we really value them in terms of their contribution, particularly around the world and on the continent in particular?
I would have expected that the African Union, which, as you know, is the successor to the Organization of African Unity, one would hope that the AU or the regional bodies like the Southern African SADC countries, that we would recognize leaders who have been outstanding in the capacities in which they played. And we should begin to create a society of leaders who are elders, whose experiences should be tapped in by especially those who are in power. I mean, there are disturbing features in the continent. We have, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you say to yourself, here is a young man whose relative was president who left office through the barrel of the gun. Now, he comes there. It appears from us looking from the outside that he should long have left office. But he sits in office because he controls the gun. It can't be so. You know, we see in our neighboring country, Zimbabwe, that yes, there has been you know, free and fair elections. You were there, you covered the elections, but the fact of the matter is that Mnangagwa came via a military coup. Let's call it what it is. It is a military coup. Supported
by the MDC. They were there when the military was out there, you know, with its Operation Restore Legacy, and they even went to the inauguration of Mnangagwa.
I'm not so sure that they supported the military coup. I think they were rejoicing that Mugabe was and his legacy. There's something about Mugabe. I see people say, look, what about Mnangagwa? He was there too. He can't be different from Mugabe. There is no one in Zimbabwe who's like Mugabe other than Mugabe.
And that was a conversation between our foreign editor, Sophie Mokoena, and of course, Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza.